Welcome, everybody, to History Analyzed. I'm your host, Mark Palmer. This is a podcast which examines historic events and issues. The issue we're analyzing today is the Electoral College. Every 4 years in the United States, we have an election to select a new president, but the individual citizens do not vote for the new chief executive. People think that they're voting for president, but they're not. It's because of the Electoral College. In this episode, we're going to explore a few different issues. First, what is the Electoral College? Second, how did we get it? Third, how has it worked in American history? And fourth, is it a fair system? Spoiler, it's not. Let's discuss a few terms we're going to be using. Number one, direct election. A direct election of the president would be a system where all eligible voters across the United States could vote for whoever they wanted to be president. The person getting the most votes wins. Number two, popular vote. On election night, newscasters talk about the popular vote. That simply means the total number of people who voted for that particular candidate. Number three, electors. An elector in the Electoral College is a representative from a state who actually votes for president and vice president. I'll explain the way they are selected and how they function later. Before we go any further, for most of the history of the United States, a majority of the population was excluded from voting. Although some states granted women's suffrage, women did not get the right to vote nationwide until the passage of the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution in 1920. And before the 15th Amendment was ratified in 1870, most black men were prevented from voting. Of course, even after the 15th Amendment, blacks were prevented from voting in these southern states by discriminatory laws, including literacy tests and poll taxes. Black voter suppression remained in effect until the 1960s with the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the 24th Amendment to the Constitution, which was ratified in 1964, outlawing poll taxes. Let's get to our first general topic. What is the Electoral College? It only applies to electing the President and Vice President of the United States. Instead of a direct nationwide popular vote, the election is a state-by-state contest wherein voters in each state select a group of electors. Those electors then cast the electoral votes for president and vice president. It's the system set forth in Article 2, Section 1 of the U.S. Constitution to select a president every 4 years. How are those electors selected? It varies a little from state to state, but generally, before the presidential election, each political party in a state selects their own group of electors. This group is known as a slate. In most states, political parties choose their slates of electors during the state party conventions. The electors can be anybody except for a member of Congress or a person holding a federal office of trust or profit. Most Americans think that when they vote on election day, they are voting for a particular candidate. They are not. When Americans vote for president, they are technically voting for that candidate's specific slate of electors. In other words, the party which wins the popular vote in a particular state gets to send their slate of electors to vote in the Electoral College. So, if the Republican candidate wins a particular state, the Republican slate of electors gets to vote in the Electoral College, which actually elects the president. In 48 out of the 50 states, the candidate who wins the most popular votes in the state receives all of that state's electoral votes. Washington, D.C. is not a state. However, pursuant to the 23rd Amendment, Washington, D.C. gets 3 electoral votes and operates the same way of winner take all. The 2 exceptions are Maine and Nebraska. They use a proportional system. Whoever wins in either Maine or Nebraska automatically gets 2 electoral votes and then 1 elector chosen based upon the winner of each congressional district. Let's do some examples to make this clear. California, where I live, is by far the largest state by population. Currently, California gets 54 electoral votes. On Election Day, the person who receives the most votes for president in California is awarded all 54 of California's electoral votes. That's the way 48 states and Washington, D.C. award their votes. It's called the winner-take-all basis. Maine and Nebraska sometimes split their electoral votes between 2 or more candidates. Our second general topic is, how did we get the Electoral College? Before we discuss that, we need to dive into how Congress is selected. The U.S. has a bicameral legislature. That means that we have 2 chambers in the legislative part of our government, the House of Representatives and the Senate. In the Senate, every state receives 2 members. So, an enormous state like California, with about 39.5 million people, gets 2 senators. And a small population state like Wyoming, with approximately 590,000 people, also gets 2 senators. But the House of Representatives is based upon population. Every state gets at least 1 representative. And based upon the population, a particular state is awarded more representatives in the House. In 2026, California has the most, with 52 representatives. 6 states have such small populations that they only have 1 member in the House of Representatives. Those would be Alaska, Delaware, North Dakota, South Dakota, Vermont, and Wyoming. There are no congressional districts in those 6 states. The single House member represents the entire state. That means that everybody in each of those 6 states votes directly for their representative in Congress. The other 44 states are divided into congressional districts. In each individual congressional district, those citizens directly vote for their member in the House of Representatives to represent that particular congressional district. When we vote for representatives for the House of Representatives, it is a straightforward vote by the people in that congressional district. What about the Senate? We vote directly for our senators. In every state, senators are selected in a statewide election. Only 1 senator is up for an election at a particular time. Senators serve 6-year terms. The terms are staggered, so the 2 senators from a particular state are not up for election in the same year. When a senator's term is up, the entire state votes to replace that senator. But it wasn't always this way. Originally, under Article 1, Section 3 of the Constitution, United States senators were not selected by the people. State legislatures picked the 2 senators that represented each state in Congress. In 1913, the 17th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was ratified. The 17th Amendment was the only amendment to substantially change the structure of Congress. The 17th Amendment allowed voters in each of the states to directly select their own senators. Now let's talk a little bit about the history of the U.S. Constitution. The United States was originally organized under the Articles of Confederation. Without going into too many details, the country was floundering under that structure. In the summer of 1787, delegates from 12 of the states met in Philadelphia and created the United States Constitution. Right now, a lot of you are thinking, hey, there were 13 original states. Who didn't send delegates? We're looking at you, Rhode Island. Eventually, the Constitution was ratified by all of the states, including Rhode Island. The Constitution has been the basis for our federal government ever since. Some people at the 1787 Constitutional Convention thought that the Congress should select the president, but that would violate the whole idea of separation of powers. That is the basic principle of our federal government. There are three separate branches of government: the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. The idea is that the legislature creates laws. That would be Congress. The executive, meaning the president and his administration, executes the laws. And I'm saying his because, unbelievably, we have still not had a female president. Except for Barack Obama, all of our presidents have been white males. The third branch of government is the judicial, meaning the Supreme Court and the subsidiary federal courts. Their job is to interpret the laws. If Congress was allowed to select the president, then we would not have an actual separation of two of the three branches of government. The term is checks and balances. Theoretically, each of the three branches of government poses a check on the other two. So if we are not going to have Congress pick the president, why not have a direct national election? There were several reasons. Number one, everybody at the Constitutional Convention was convinced that George Washington would be the first president. They were worried what would happen after George Washington retired. The framers of the Constitution thought that most voters in a popular election would simply vote for candidates from their own states. And then it would be tough to get a majority with people voting for individuals from their own states, commonly referred to as favorite sons. Number two, many of the framers of the Constitution were elitists. The thought was that the electors would be better educated than the average voter. The framers of the Constitution envisioned the electors in the Electoral College being totally independent and voting for whoever they wished. But reason number three appears to be the primary reason for the Electoral College: slavery. At the Constitutional Convention of 1787, the people from the southern states wanted to have two opposite definitions of enslaved people. On one hand, they contended that the slaves were not really people. They were pieces of property. That's why they could buy and sell them or even murder them if they wished. However, when it came to representation in the federal government, they wanted to have the slaves counted as people. They argued that a state like South Carolina, which had a large percentage of its inhabitants enslaved, should have representation in Congress based upon the free and slave populations. Certainly, these two positions were contradictory. Either the slaves were people or they weren't. But the men at the Constitutional Convention in 1787 were trying to find compromises so everybody could agree to the new form of government. This is when the disgraceful 3/5 rule was reached. Individuals who were enslaved were not really counted as people as far as rights. They had none. But for representation in Congress, they would be counted as 3/5 of a person. Remember that the House of Representatives is based upon the population of a state. Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution reads in pertinent part, "Representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included within this Union, according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons." Don't you just love that nice little euphemism, 3/5 of all other persons? The original U.S. Constitution never used the word slave or slavery. The word slavery finally came up in the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. The men at the 1787 Constitutional Convention knew that they were dealing with something indefensible and did not want to outright mention it. So they used terms like all other persons. Anyway, that's how representation in the House of Representatives was determined. Here's an example. In the 1850 census, South Carolina had a total population of 668,507 people. The 1850 census recorded the following three demographic groups: whites, free colored, and slaves. My apologies, those are not my terms. Those are the categories listed in the census report. Here was the population breakdown. Whites, 274,563. Free colored, the term the census used for blacks who were not enslaved, 8,960. Slaves, 384,984. So when determining how many members South Carolina would get in the House of Representatives, they counted the total number of free individuals and then added 3/5 of the number of enslaved people. How does that relate to today's topic? In the Electoral College, every state is awarded electoral votes by the total number of senators and representatives they have. So you could see why this would appeal to the slave states. Getting back to my example of South Carolina, 1852 was the first presidential election after the census of 1850. If it were a direct election, only the free male citizens of South Carolina would be able to vote. That was actually a minority of the population. Whites only accounted for 41% of the population. Enslaved people were almost 58%. The remaining were the free blacks in the state. Thus, in a direct presidential election, South Carolina would have been drawing from the 274,563 white people in the state, but not all of them can vote. First, we have to divide that number by approximately 1/2 because women could not vote in those days. That gives us a white male population of approximately 137,000. But in those days, you had to be 21 years old to vote. I could not find exact figures, but somewhere about half the population was 21 or over. Keep in mind that these are approximations to make a point. Reducing the approximately 137,000 white males in the state by half leaves only approximately 69,000 eligible voters in South Carolina in a direct election. Compare that to the largest state at the time, New York, with a population of 3,097,394, all of whom were free. After eliminating the roughly 1/2 of the population who were female and the approximately half the white males under the age of 21, New York would have something like 774,000 voters in a direct presidential election. That would mean that New York would have approximately 11 times the votes of South Carolina if it were a direct election for president. Again, I'm just rounding these numbers to illustrate this matter. So, to be fair, in the Electoral College, New York should have had 11 times the number of electoral votes as South Carolina at that time. But in the Electoral College, South Carolina was awarded with electoral votes, which included 3/5 of all the enslaved people. So the state was overrepresented. In the presidential election of 1852, New York had 35 electoral votes and South Carolina had 8. New York received only 4.4 times the amount of electoral votes than South Carolina, even though New York had approximately 11 times the number of eligible voters than South Carolina. This is what made the slave states greatly overrepresented in the Electoral College. They had a larger say in elections than if it was just a simple direct vote with a majority rule like all other elections in the United States. Right now you might be wondering, why did the northern states agree to this 3/5 rule, which would give the southern states overrepresentation in presidential elections? There were a lot of compromises in the Constitutional Convention of 1787. The framers were trying to unify the states into one functioning country. Under the Articles of Confederation, each state was like a separate country that kind of cooperated with other American states. By the time of the Constitutional Convention in 1787, most of the northern states had either outlawed slavery or were in the process of doing so. But slavery was still very strong in the southern states. The Southerners were driven by their goal to protect their way of life, which was a nice way of putting the ability to own other human beings. And unless slavery was protected, the southern states would not agree to the new Constitution. We've now covered the first two general topics. What is the Electoral College, and why was it created at the Constitutional Convention? Now let's discuss the third topic. How has the Electoral College worked in American history? There were several elections where problems arose using the system to select a president. The first occurred in 1800. Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution said that the electors would vote by ballot for two persons. Whoever received the most votes would be president, and whoever received the second most would be vice president. The framers of the Constitution did not think that the electors would vote along party lines. They thought that the electors would vote for the two best men for the job, and again, they were only presuming men. This is how it worked out in the election of 1796. John Adams got the most electoral votes and became the second president. Thomas Jefferson got the second most electoral votes and became vice president. Fun fact, this is the only time in American history when the president and vice president were from different political parties. Adams was a Federalist and Jefferson was a Democratic Republican. Both of those parties are long gone. For short, Jefferson's party was usually referred to as the Republican Party, but it has no relationship to the current Republican Party, which was founded in 1854. Things went smoothly in 1796, but 4 years later, in the election of 1800, the electors voted along party lines. They did not vote for the two best men for the job. The Federalists were more organized. The Federalist electors voted for John Adams and Charles Pinckney. To ensure that Adams would be president and Pinckney vice president, one Federalist elector did not include Pinckney on his ballot. As a result, Adams received 65 electoral votes and Pinckney got 64. The Republicans messed up. They all voted for both Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. As a result, Jefferson and Burr each received 73 votes. That meant there was a tie for president. Most people in both parties assumed that Aaron Burr would say the intention was that Jefferson would be president, and so he would simply accept the vice presidency. But he didn't say that. Burr refused to say anything on the subject. Since there was a tie, Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution stated that the House of Representatives would decide. In the House, each state would get one vote to select the president. Although he was not in Congress, Alexander Hamilton was the leader of the Federalist Party. Hamilton and Jefferson despised each other. They had been rivals in George Washington's cabinet. Jefferson was the first Secretary of State in U.S. history, and Hamilton was the first Secretary of the Treasury. They clashed a lot. Hamilton wrote many letters to the Federalists in the House of Representatives to make Jefferson president. As much as Hamilton disliked Jefferson personally, he believed that Jefferson would be a much better president than the devious Aaron Burr. Hamilton's opinion wasn't the only reason, but it helped break the deadlock. And the House of Representatives elected Jefferson president. This was one of many disputes between Burr and Hamilton, which eventually led to them having a duel on July 11, 1804, in Weehawken, New Jersey. Supposedly, Hamilton shot into the air, which duelists sometimes did to avoid killing their opponent, but to preserve each side's honor. And don't ask me how any of this nonsense of dueling preserved anybody's honor. Burr shot Hamilton in the abdomen, and he died the next day. In one of the most bizarre incidents in American history, the sitting Vice President of the United States killed the former Secretary of the Treasury. To avoid the mess that occurred in the election of 1800, on June 15, 1804, the 12th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified. Under that amendment, electors no longer just voted for two people. Electors specifically named who they were voting for to be president and who they were voting for as vice president. The next problem election occurred in 1824. The Federalist Party was long gone, and the Democratic-Republican Party was falling apart since there was no opposition to them. As a result, people weren't voting along party lines. 4 men received electoral votes: Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams, William Crawford, and Henry Clay. But nobody got a majority. Pursuant to the 12th Amendment of the Constitution, the House of Representatives would decide between the 3 top electoral vote getters. Since Henry Clay came in 4th, he was out. And in the House vote, every state would get 1 vote. It would either be Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams, or William Crawford. Although there is no direct evidence of a deal being made, many people at the time, and many historians currently, believe that there was an understanding between Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams. Clay would throw his support to Adams, and that's how Adams became president. In return, Adams appointed Henry Clay Secretary of State. Andrew Jackson had a total meltdown. He had received the most electoral votes with 99 and had received the most popular votes across the country. Jackson thought that he should be president. He and his supporters started screaming about the corrupt bargain between Adams and Clay. That term, corrupt bargain, became famous at the time and has remained so in American history. As a result of this election, the supporters of Andrew Jackson formed a new party called the Democrats. This was primarily done by Martin Van Buren. By creating the Democratic Party, Van Buren ensured that Jackson won the next 2 presidential elections in 1828 and 1832, and Van Buren himself won the presidential election of 1836. The election of 1824 was the first time that the candidate who won the popular vote was not elected president. Jackson got the most votes from citizens across the country, but it did him no good. Things were even wilder in the election of 1876. Before we discuss the election, I first have to set the scene. The Civil War ended in 1865. After that came an era known as Reconstruction. During Reconstruction, federal troops occupied the 11 states that had formed the Confederacy. By 1876, federal soldiers were still occupying some of the former Confederate states to protect the rights of black people living there. The Republican candidate in 1876 was Governor Rutherford B. Hayes of Ohio. The Democratic candidate for president was New York Governor Samuel Tilden. Tilden won the popular vote. Of course, that didn't matter because of the Electoral College. There were disputes regarding 4 states. One was Oregon. Just about everybody agreed that Hayes won Oregon's popular vote and should receive its electoral votes. However, one of the Republican electors was also a postmaster, and the Constitution forbids federal office holders from being electors. That elector resigned his postmaster job, but the Democratic governor ruled that he had been postmaster on the day of the election and so was ineligible. The governor replaced him with a Democratic elector to vote for Tilden. The big disputes were regarding the election results in 3 of the former Confederate states: Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina. The Democrats claimed that Tilden won the popular vote in all 3 of those states. Therefore, he should get all of the electoral votes from Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina. If he got the votes from even one of those states, Tilden would be president. But the Republicans claimed that there had been voter suppression and intimidation of black voters in those states. All 4 of the states I just mentioned sent into Congress 2 different sets of election results. In Congress, a compromise was reached whereby a commission of 15 men would decide which votes counted. There would be 5 House members, 5 senators, and 5 members from the Supreme Court. The 15 men would be split with 7 Democrats, 7 Republicans, and 1 independent. That independent was David Davis of the Supreme Court. Davis, though, refused to serve on this commission because he had just been elected senator. He was replaced by another Supreme Court justice who was considered a Republican. Since the commission was now 8-7 Republicans versus Democrats, you can guess how this was resolved. By a vote of 8-7, the commission awarded all of the disputed electoral votes to Hayes. This was enough to make Hayes president. Democrats around the country felt that they were being robbed, and there were even threats of a new civil war. The conflict was finally resolved with what's been called the Compromise of 1877. The Democrats would accept Hayes winning the presidency, but they got something that they very much wanted: the end of Reconstruction. Federal troops were removed from the South. In those days, the vast majority of white Southerners were Democrats. That was the party that had been defending slavery for decades. So, Rutherford B. Hayes got to be president by selling out the rights of black people in the South. This ushered in the Jim Crow era. That is the term referencing the time from the end of Reconstruction up until the 1960s, when the laws in the southern states were aimed at 2 main goals when it came to black people: suppressing the voting rights of blacks and enforcing segregation. Besides being the most disputed election in American history, 1876 also set some records. Number 1, it had the highest voter turnout. Approximately 82% of eligible American voters went to the polls. Number 2, it was the closest electoral vote. The final results were Hayes received 185 electoral votes and Tilden got 184. Hayes was elected by 1 electoral vote. The next time a candidate won the popular vote, but not the Electoral College, was in 1888. Democrat Grover Cleveland was the sitting president. He won the popular vote in 1888 as he ran for re-election. Even though he lost the popular vote by over 100,000 votes, Republican Benjamin Harrison won the Electoral College 233 to 168. 4 years later, in the election of 1892, Grover Cleveland defeated Benjamin Harrison and became the first person to serve 2 non-consecutive terms as president. The next time somebody lost the popular vote but became president occurred in 2000. Democrat Al Gore had just served 2 terms as vice president. His Republican opponent was Texas Governor George W. Bush. Gore won the popular vote by approximately 500,000 votes. As the electoral votes rolled in, it became clear on election night that Florida was going to determine the election. Florida had 25 electoral votes at the time. The results in Florida were so close that a recount occurred. During that time, there were lawsuits in Florida and eventually a hearing before the United States Supreme Court. The Supreme Court halted the recount. The final determination was that George W. Bush won Florida by only 537 votes. That is incredibly close, especially when you consider almost 6 million people voted in Florida that year. Only 4 elections after the close one in 2000, a person won the presidency via the Electoral College while losing the popular vote. In the 2016 election, Democrat Hillary Clinton was facing Republican Donald Trump. Clinton won the popular vote by almost 3 million votes, but in the Electoral College, it wasn't close. Trump got 304 electoral votes to Clinton's 227. There was also one occasion when there were difficulties deciding on a vice president. In the election of 1836, Democrat Martin Van Buren was elected president. Van Buren's running mate in 1836 was Richard Mentor Johnson. He was a fascinating guy. Richard Mentor Johnson represented Kentucky in the House of Representatives and in the Senate. Here's where Johnson becomes so interesting. He was a slaveholder from Kentucky. A mixed-race woman named Julia Chin was one of Johnson's enslaved women. Before the Civil War, a lot of white masters had sex with their enslaved women, but they tried to keep it quiet. This brings us back to Richard Johnson. He appears to be unique among prominent slaveholders of the antebellum South because he was very open about his relationship with Julia Chin. He referred to her as his wife. Of course, they could not legally be married in those days. And in case you're thinking, well, yeah, things were very racist in the 1830s, that's certainly true. But that racism dragged on for more than another century. As late as 1967, there were 16 states which had anti-miscegenation laws. Those were laws that made interracial marriage illegal. The term miscegenation arose from the Civil War meaning to mix races. The states that still had such laws in 1967 were Alabama, Arkansas, Delaware, Florida, Georgia, Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi, Missouri, North Carolina, Oklahoma, South Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, Virginia, and West Virginia. In 1967, in the case of Loving versus Virginia, the Supreme Court unanimously ruled that such laws were unconstitutional. The Supreme Court said that such laws violated the equal protection and due process clauses of the 14th Amendment. Getting back to Richard Johnson. Besides referring to Julia Chin as his wife, Johnson also openly acknowledged that he was the father of 2 daughters with her. This is what brings us to today's subject. When the electoral votes were counted, Martin Van Buren received 170. He was clearly the president. Since people were voting for tickets, meaning a president and vice president together, you would think that Johnson would also have 170 electoral votes. He was supposed to, but this was a case of faithless electors. A faithless elector is a member of the Electoral College who votes for someone other than the presidential or vice presidential candidate they were pledged to support. Electors are expected to honor their state's popular vote. A faithless elector breaks this pledge and votes for somebody else. The Van Buren-Johnson ticket won the popular vote in the state of Virginia. The electors from Virginia gave their 23 electoral votes to Martin Van Buren for president. But even though they were supposed to give their 23 electoral votes to Johnson for vice president, they refused because of his relationship with Julia Chin. Most white men in the slave states were okay with masters having sex with their slaves. It was just one of the many horrible things that enslaved women had to put up with. But they drew the line at a white man claiming that he was in love with his enslaved woman and publicly acknowledging that he was the father of her 2 daughters. So those 23 faithless electors from Virginia refused to give Johnson their votes. They voted for somebody named William Smith for vice president. As a result, Richard Johnson had 147 electoral votes, which was one shy of the 148 he needed to be elected vice president. This is when the 12th Amendment of the Constitution came into play. The Senate would select the new vice president. You might be wondering, how come this goes to the Senate? Under the 12th Amendment, a dispute about the election of the president goes to the House of Representatives. But it's different for the election of a vice president. This is because, as set forth in Article 1, Section 3 of the Constitution, one of the primary duties of the vice president is to act as the person who presides over the Senate. So that's why the Senate gets to choose when there's a dispute as to who becomes the new vice president. On February 8, 1837, the Senate voted essentially along party lines, and Richard Johnson became vice president. This is the only time in American history when the Senate had to select a new vice president. Now it's time to discuss our 4th and final general topic about the Electoral College. Is it a fair system? The answer is definitely no, and I will explain why in detail. Reason number one, the Electoral College violates the one person, one vote doctrine. The principle of one person, one vote is the basis of democracy. In 1964, the U.S. Supreme Court addressed this issue in the case of Reynolds versus Sims. The basis of that case was the fact that the Alabama districts for their state legislature had drastically different populations. One district had 41 times as many eligible voters as another district in Alabama. The U.S. Supreme Court held that Alabama's continued use of legislative districts based off of the 1900 census violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. The court found that the Equal Protection Clause requires no less than substantially equal state legislative representation for all citizens. Therefore, states are required to make honest and good faith efforts to reapportion and draw their legislative districts with as nearly equal population as is practicable. In a 1963 case, Gray versus Sanders, the Supreme Court stated, "The conception of political equality from the Declaration of Independence to Lincoln's Gettysburg Address to the 15th, 17th, and 19th Amendments can mean only one thing: one person, one vote." In 1964, in another Supreme Court case, Westbury versus Sanders, the one-person, one-vote principle was applied to the House of Representatives. The court ruled that congressional districts must have roughly equal populations, if at all possible. The court stated, "As nearly as is practicable, one person's vote in a congressional election is to be worth as much as another's." The Electoral College is a flagrant violation of the one-person, one-vote rule. Here's an example. My state of California has by far the largest population with approximately 39.5 million people. Wyoming has the smallest population with approximately 590,000 people. That means the number of inhabitants in California is over 67 times the number of people living in Wyoming. If the Electoral College adhered to the one-person, one-vote ideal, then California would have at least 67 times the number of electoral votes that Wyoming gets. But that's not the case. California has 54 electoral votes and Wyoming has 3. That means that California has only 18 times the number of electoral votes that Wyoming has, when to be fair, it should be 67 times. 18 is a far cry from 67. Let's look at it another way. With 3 electoral votes for a population of 590,000, that means that each elector from Wyoming represents 196,000 people. But with 54 electoral votes for the 39.5 million inhabitants, that means each elector from California represents 731,000 residents. One electoral vote for every 196,000 people in Wyoming compared to one electoral vote for every 731,000 people in California is not even close to the one-person, one-vote principle, which is supposed to be a bedrock of American democracy. A fundamental value of any democracy or a republic is political equality, meaning every citizen's voice should count as much as anyone else's. And in case you're wondering, why hasn't the Supreme Court struck this down as unconstitutional? Although it violates the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, the Electoral College is set forth in Article 2, Section 1, as well as the 12th Amendment of the Constitution. Since the Electoral College was created in the Constitution, it is, by definition, constitutional and cannot be struck down by the Supreme Court. Reason number 2 why the Electoral College is a bad system: most states get ignored. People who defend the Electoral College say that it's necessary to protect the small states. And by small, we mean by population, not by geographic size. But it's not true. Politicians don't spend their time in Wyoming, Alaska, or North Dakota, or any of the states with only 3 electoral votes. Of course, candidates also ignore large states if it's clear which way that state will vote. Let's take the 2 largest states, California and Texas. You would think that candidates would campaign in those 2 states because there are so many electoral votes available. But that's the thing. Those votes are not really available. In presidential elections, California has voted for the Democratic candidate every time since 1992. Texas has voted for the Republican candidate for president in every election since 1980. Texas has over 31 million residents and 40 electoral votes. With 54 and 40 electors respectively, California and Texas have a total of 94 electoral votes. There are currently 538 electoral votes. To get a majority and win the presidency, a candidate must get at least 270 electoral votes. That means that California and Texas combined represent over 1/3 of all of the electoral votes needed to become president. Yet candidates don't campaign in the 2 largest states. That's because in recent elections, everybody assumes California is going to vote Democratic and Texas is going to vote Republican. So why bother? Think of it this way. The current population of the United States is approximately 342 million. With a combined population of approximately 71 million people in California and Texas, that means that those 2 states account for approximately 1/5 of the population of the United States. Right from the beginning of a campaign, the Democrats and Republicans immediately write off at least 1/5 of the American voters. And it's actually much worse than that. I was just giving you examples of the 2 largest states, but in reality, all campaigning focuses on the few states that are considered swing states. That means a state which might vote for the Democrat or the Republican, we just don't know. I couldn't find data regarding the 2024 election, but in 2020, 96% of the presidential campaign visits and advertising was in just 12 states. And the only reason it's 96% instead of 100% is because candidates will go to the non-swing states to raise money. In election years, both Democrats and Republicans go to California and Texas for fundraisers. But they don't give speeches and they don't spend money on advertising because they know which way California and Texas are going to vote. The same holds true in other large states like New York with its 28 electoral votes, which has voted Democratic in every election since 1988. This is why I laugh when anybody makes that argument that the Electoral College is necessary to protect the rights of those small population states so they don't get ignored. The small states certainly get ignored, as well as many of the larger states, by the parties and their candidates. How is this representative democracy when a dozen states, or sometimes less, determine the election? In 2024, there were only 7 states that were considered swing states: Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Those 7 states total approximately 63 million people. That's about 18% of the total population of the United States. That means that around 82% of American voters were completely ignored in 2024 by both parties and their candidates. How is this representative democracy? Let's look at it another way. The number of people in California is more than the population of Utah, Nevada, Iowa, Arkansas, Kansas, Mississippi, New Mexico, Idaho, Nebraska, West Virginia, Hawaii, New Hampshire, Maine, Montana, Rhode Island, Delaware, North Dakota, South Dakota, Alaska, Vermont, and Wyoming. Those 21 states have a total of 92 electoral votes. That means that the approximately 38 million people in those 21 states get 92 electoral votes, while the over 39 million people in California only get 54 electoral votes. I used California as the demonstration not because I live here, but because it is the biggest state and has the largest disparity. But the same principle of inequity holds true for Texas, Florida, New York, and the other large population states. I know there are a lot of numbers in this episode, but it's necessary because of the topic. I do my own calculations, and hopefully they are correct. But even if my calculations are a little off, they still demonstrate the point I'm making about the inequity of the Electoral College system. Reason number 3 why the Electoral College is a bad system: undemocratic outcomes. Earlier, I listed for you the 5 times that the person who won the popular vote did not become president because of the Electoral College. This is against the basic tenets of democracy. I just looked up democracy on the Merriam-Webster website. The first definition says, government by the people, rule of the majority. It doesn't say rule of the people in certain jurisdictions, such as the Electoral College swing states. Democracy is based on the national popular will. And without getting sidetracked, of course, certain rights of minorities are protected by the Bill of Rights and other parts of the U.S. Constitution. Those rights, set forth in the Constitution, prevent a tyranny of the majority. But regarding today's episode, the point is that there is something just fundamentally wrong about somebody getting the most votes yet still losing a presidential election. Reason number 4 why the Electoral College is a bad system: it leads to a depression in voter turnout. Voters in safe states, meaning states that reliably vote for one party, feel that their votes do not matter. This leads to lower turnout. If not for the Electoral College, every person's vote would count. If the president were selected in a direct election, meaning the person who got the most votes nationwide, candidates in their parties would go after every individual vote. Let's take California and Texas again. In the 2024 presidential race, Democrat Kamala Harris received 9,276,179 votes in California, and Republican Donald Trump received 6,081,697. Harris easily won with 58.5% of votes cast. But look at it this way: Trump got 38.3% of the votes without even campaigning or spending money in California. In a direct popular election wherein every vote counted, Trump would have been incentivized to campaign in California. If he got over 6 million votes in the state without even trying, how many could he have received if he and the Republican Party made a big effort here? The reverse holds true in Texas. Trump easily won there with 6,375,376 votes, which accounted for 56.3%. Without really trying or spending money, Harris received 4,806,474 votes, or 42.4%. Harris would have campaigned in Texas if those votes mattered in a direct election. In 2024, a little over 16 million Californians voted. This was out of almost 27 million people who were eligible to vote in California. In 2024, about 11.3 million people voted in Texas. This was out of approximately 22.7 million people who were eligible to vote in Texas. I'm just giving you those figures because those are the 2 largest states. But the percentages are probably the same in most states. Voter turnout is so low because so many people feel that there's no point due to the Electoral College. My wife and I vote in every election, but I could see why people here in California, as well as Texas, feel that it's a waste of their time. One individual vote is not going to change the fact that California is going to vote Democratic and Texas is going to vote Republican. However, if every individual vote counted in a popular election, people would feel differently. When people believe their vote counts, they're more likely to vote. Reason number 5 is related to number 4, the winner-take-all system. Except for Nebraska and Maine, all other states, along with Washington, D.C., use the winner-take-all system. That means all of the electoral votes of that particular state go to the presidential candidate that won the popular vote in that state, no matter how small the margin is. There's no splitting of votes. So if you vote for the losing candidate, your vote is meaningless. But if every individual vote counted in a popular election, no vote would be worthless. Reason number 6 why the Electoral College is a bad system: we don't use it for anything else. Why do we choose the president this way when we don't select our governors or any other elected officials in an Electoral College manner? When voting for governor, no state allocates a certain number of electoral votes per county. If the Electoral College was truly a good idea to represent the interests of small states versus big states, wouldn't the same hold true for counties? Again, I'm using California as an example only because Los Angeles County is almost twice as large by population as any other county in the country. LA County has a population of approximately 9.7 million people. To put that into perspective, 40 different states have smaller populations than the county of Los Angeles. Now let's contrast that with the smallest county in California. Alpine County has a population of approximately 1,200 people. Most middle schools are bigger than that. Shouldn't we worry about the people from this tiny county? Their rights aren't being represented compared to the enormous county of Los Angeles. If the argument that some people make for the Electoral College was true, that we had to worry about people in geographical units with smaller populations, then we would use an Electoral College system to elect governors in each state. But we don't because it would be ridiculous. Those Supreme Court cases I outlined earlier stated that the principle of one person, one vote is the goal. Reason number 7 against the Electoral College: faithless electors. That is the term for electors who do not vote for the person who won the popular vote in their state. Earlier, I gave you the example of Richard Mentor Johnson for vice president in 1836, when all 23 of the electors from Virginia refused to vote for him because of his personal life with an enslaved woman. There have also been faithless electors regarding the selection of the president. 2 examples are considered acceptable. In 1820, James Monroe essentially ran unopposed for president. An elector from New Hampshire named William Plumer cast his vote for John Quincy Adams instead of James Monroe. He did this because he thought that George Washington should be the only person to have the honor of being unanimously elected. The other instance when people thought that faithless electors were acceptable occurred in 1872. Republican Ulysses S. Grant was running for re-election. His opponent was Horace Greeley, who was backed by the Democratic Party as well as the one-year entity called the Liberal Republican Party. Grant won the popular vote by over 760,000 votes and was easily re-elected with 286 electoral votes. On November 29, 1872, Horace Greeley died. This was after the election, but before the Electoral College cast its votes. Since Greeley was dead, the electors who were committed to him gave their votes to 4 different candidates for president. Since it did not change the election results, everybody was fine with that outcome. People were okay with those 2 instances, but there have been other occasions where faithless electors voted for someone other than the presidential candidate that won their state's popular vote. There was one faithless elector in several different elections in the 20th century. There were 7 faithless electors in the presidential election of 2016 between Republican Donald Trump and Democrat Hillary Clinton. This issue of faithless electors went to the U.S. Supreme Court in the 2020 case of Chiafalo versus Washington. In a unanimous decision, the Supreme Court held that nothing in the Constitution prohibits a state from taking away the discretion of presidential electors. The Supreme Court held that the long settled and established practice of voting in this nation requires finding that electors are required to vote for the candidate whom the state's voters have chosen. But think about that ruling in Chiafalo versus Washington. All the Supreme Court said was that the states have the authority to have laws requiring the electors to vote like the popular vote of that state. There is still no federal law or constitutional provision that requires electors to vote like the popular vote of their state. And although faithless electors have never changed the outcome of a presidential election, it's still a possibility. According to the Library of Congress, the National Conference of State Legislatures, as well as fairvote.org, there are several states which still do not have any laws prohibiting faithless electors. Reason number 8, the Electoral College makes it extremely difficult for any third-party candidates. The Electoral College's winner-take-all system makes it exceptionally difficult for third-party candidates to succeed. This is because the Electoral College requires winning entire states to gain electoral votes rather than proportional representation. This system effectively penalizes minor party candidates, leading to the two-party dominance and discouraging third-party participation. No third-party candidate has ever come close to winning a presidential election. After hearing this episode, you might be wondering, why don't we get rid of the Electoral College? There are two main reasons. Number one, since the Electoral College is part of the Constitution, the only way to eliminate it would be an amendment to the Constitution. Article 5 of the Constitution provides the two processes to amend the Constitution. One way is by a constitutional convention called by 2/3 of the state legislatures. That has never happened. All 27 of the amendments to the Constitution have been passed by the other procedure listed in Article 5. An amendment may be proposed by Congress by a 2/3 majority vote in both the House of Representatives and the Senate. Once Congress approves the proposed amendment, it is submitted to the states for ratification. 3/4 of the states must ratify the proposed amendment for it to become part of the U.S. Constitution. The Constitution can be amended, but it's not easy. That's why in the 238 years since the Constitution was ratified, there have only been 27 amendments. Number 2, people who believe that the Electoral College favors them oppose eliminating that system. There are 3 groups that oppose replacing the Electoral College with some type of direct vote. Group A, small population states. The people from Wyoming who receive 1 electoral vote for every 196,000 people, compared to 1 electoral vote for every 731,000 people in California, do not want to lose their overrepresentation. The same is true for all of these small population states. It's tough to get 3/4 of the states to ratify an amendment when so many states have a vested interest in keeping their overrepresentation in the Electoral College. Group B, swing states. As we discussed earlier, parties and candidates only pay attention to those battleground states which could vote either way. People from these swing states don't want to give up such influence. Group C, whichever party feels that the Electoral College favors them. Currently, the Electoral College greatly favors the Republican Party. This was clearly evidenced in the elections of 2000 and 2016, when George W. Bush and Donald Trump each lost the popular vote but won the Electoral College. Also, most of the rural states have small populations and are overrepresented in their electoral votes. and those rural states tend to vote Republican. Don't get me wrong, if the Electoral College was favoring the Democrats, then the Democratic Party would be against replacing the Electoral College with a direct vote. What could be the alternative to the Electoral College? I personally prefer a direct vote. Whoever receives the most votes from Americans throughout the country wins. That would adhere to the one person, one vote principle of American democracy. I'm in the majority with my opinion. According to the Pew Research Center, in 2024, 63% of Americans would prefer to see the winner of the presidential election be the person who wins the most votes nationally. Some people would like to see a threshold for a person to win, such as the winning person must get at least 40% of the popular vote, or there would be a runoff between the top two vote getters. That seems like a reasonable rule to me. But for the reasons I've outlined, I think we are stuck with the Electoral College. That's it for today. Please subscribe to this podcast. Ratings and reviews really help. If you're listening on a podcast app which allows ratings, I'd greatly appreciate a 5-star rating. Spotify allows comments and reviews of a particular episode. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, it's easy to leave a review. Scroll down the History Analyzed show page, select a rating, and then tap Write a Review. Please tell your friends, relatives, coworkers. Word of mouth is the best way to increase the audience for History Analyzed. Check out my website, historyanalyzed.com, where you will find links to fun items for history geeks. Thank you for listening. Catch you next episode.